Hey guys, what's up? It's Eric with Advanced Level Automotive. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. Today, I'm back here at one of the shops I do work for. I got called out to take a look at this 2009. It's a Chevrolet Malibu. It's got the 4-cylinder Ecotec engine. The customer complaint is that the vehicle will intermittently be a no crank, no start. So most of the time, the car cranks up, starts just fine, but every now and then, after driving the car for a while, it will just be a no crank, no start. And what they're saying is that after they wait about 20 minutes or so, let the car cool down, it starts right back up. So the shop is telling me that they did scan it for codes. They didn't find any relevant codes at the time, though this car just got dropped off again by the customer because I guess they kind of been going back and forth with it. Sometimes with these intermittent problems, it's really difficult to diagnose them because you kind of have to catch it when it's happening. And so what they're telling me is that the last week that they had the car, they could never recreate the problem. They could never duplicate it, so they weren't able to pinpoint exactly what was going on. And again, like I said, they didn't have any codes that related to the vehicle not starting. And so they had the customer pick up the car. The customer took the car, and within a couple of days, it started happening again. And so they just brought it back. So anyways, we're here now. Let's check it out. All right, guys, so first things first, let's hop inside the vehicle. And we're going to see if this thing cranks and starts up. So we have the key right here. I'm gonna go ahead and stick it into the ignition, and if I can get it in there, there we go. Turn the key on. First thing I like to do before I even try to crank it is look for a check engine light. And so you can see right now we do have a check engine light illuminated. The other thing is that if you noticed the security light, I'm gonna turn the key back off and turn it back on. That security light right there, you can see that it comes on for the bulb check, but then it goes away. So that means that we don't currently have any problems. The check engine light does let us know that we do have communication with the engine computer. So right now at the moment, this car should start right up. So let's go ahead and crank it. As you guys can see, the engine starts and runs just fine. If you take a look at the instrument cluster here, you can see that we don't have a check engine light present. It did go away as soon as we started the engine up. And again, we don't have a security light on. We do have this tire pressure monitor light, but that has nothing to do with what we're dealing with right now. We're mainly focused on why this car intermittently becomes a crank no start. All right, guys, so the next thing I want to do is hook up my scan tool. So right now we have the Launch X431 Pro 3S Plus connected, and so we're going to go ahead and go into the diagnostic menu and see if we have any trouble codes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run a full health report, and what that's going to do is it's going to scan all of the modules on the vehicle. So we're going to be looking at the BCM, the ECM, TCM, all of it. I want to see if there's any codes pertaining to anything that might have to do with it being a crank and no start. All right, guys, so our code scan is finished. You can see starting up here at the top, we have the ECM engine control module. And we do have one code present, actually, a P0615, which is a starter relay control circuit. That is interesting. We do have a code stored, but we don't have a check engine light illuminated. So this is not a hard fault. This is a code that has been saved in the memory, and so that's something we're going to keep in the back of our mind, because that definitely looks like a code that could be the reason why this thing is a crank no start intermittently. And so scrolling down, we do have a code in the radio for device power voltage below threshold. So maybe the battery got low at some point in time, and so that's why it set that code. Again, we have some tire pressure monitor codes that we're not going to worry about. And then you can see here in all of the rest of the modules, we have the TCM, no codes, BCM, no codes, instrument panel, no codes, theft deterrent, no codes. So that's really important, because if this problem had anything to do with the anti-theft system, then most likely we're going to show some type of code in this module. But you guys can see we don't have any codes in that module. So right now, I'm really more concentrated on the starter relay control circuit code. And so let's go ahead and move under the hood and see if we can locate it. Let's pop the hood, open this thing up. This hood does not want to stay open by itself. Let me get something to hold it up with. All right, guys, so moving under the hood, as you can see, we use this little clamp to hold this strut open. Very useful tool to have. If you guys don't have one, I'll leave a link in the description where you can buy one. But anyway, we have the fuse box right here. Let me go ahead and pop the lid open. The engine is running at the moment, so let me pull this lid off, and there we have our relay box. And so let's go ahead and try to locate the starter relay. If we look here, you can see our starter relay is going to be number 31, start. this one right here. So if we look at the fuse layout or the relay layout, that's going to be this one over here. Now taking a look at this relay, it actually looks like somebody might have replaced this relay already. You can tell because these original relays have these numbers on here, and these two don't. So these do look like they have been replaced. That makes me curious whether or not that code was set because somebody replaced that relay. Maybe they pulled the relay out with the ignition on, and so that's why the code was set. Just something to keep in the back of my mind. All right, guys, so believe it or not, I'm actually reminded of a car that I worked on a while back that had the exact same symptoms as this car, and it was actually the exact same car, a 2009 Chevrolet Malibu, though if I'm not mistaken, I believe the last one I worked on, it had a V6, not a 4-cylinder engine, but I don't think that makes a difference. Anyway, I had this car that had the exact same symptoms, and I actually made a video about it. I might have posted it probably like 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you guys have not watched that video, I'm going to post a link in the description for that video. But essentially, that car, the customer who owned it, had the exact same problem. What would happen is that the car would start, it would crank and start just fine. But after driving it for, let's say, half an hour or so, when she would park the car, let's say she stopped at the gas station, turned the car off, pumped gas, got back into the car, attempted to start it, and it would not crank. But after letting it sit for about 20 minutes or so, the car would crank and start right up. If you watch that video, what I found was that the issue was actually inside of the fuse box. It was actually a pretty cool video, though it being an early video, it wasn't really the greatest quality. I didn't have a camera like I do now. Back then, the iPhone camera wasn't what it is now, which is what I'm filming on. But I was able to get the point across in that video, in which I actually took the fuse box apart and I showed where there was a hairline fracture on one of the copper wiring that was embedded into the fuse box. It's a really interesting design, the way GM did this fuse box, but essentially what was happening was this hairline fracture on the copper wiring would cause an issue with the starter relay, in which when the engine bay would heat up, the fuse box would heat up, and so the metal would expand and it would create that gap where it wasn't making a connection, and then once it cooled down, that gap would close. So I'm thinking that might actually be the problem that we're having with this car, though really the only way to be 100% certain is to try to heat up the fuse box. So we could do that a couple different ways. We could drive the car for an extended period of time and try to get the engine bay to warm up and see if we can get it to become a crank no start, and then we can check the output of the starter relay to see if that's what's happening. Or we could take a heat gun and use that heat gun to heat up the fuse box and see if we can recreate the problem here in the shop. So I think that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go ahead and grab a heat gun, take you guys under the hood and show you how I do this. Actually, before we move under the hood, let me show you guys that this car still cranks and starts just fine. So I just took the key out of the ignition. I'm going to turn it back on. You can see it starts, cranks and starts right up. And so right now we don't have a problem. I'm going to try it again. Stick the key back into the ignition and crank it back up. Again, it starts right up. So we don't have a problem right now. Let's try to heat up the fuse box and see if we can get it to become a no crank, no start. All right, guys, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this heat gun right here and I'm going to turn it on. And then we're basically going to heat up this fuse box. Now, when you do this, you do want to make sure that you keep the heat evenly moving across the fuse box. You don't want to stay in one spot too long because you will melt something. And so I'm basically just going to do this for a couple minutes and try to warm up this fuse box. Then we're going to see if this thing becomes no crank, no start.
A few moments later.
All right, so after a few minutes of doing this, I'm gonna go ahead and see if we can start the vehicle up. I'm gonna put my heat gun down. Now let's move inside and see if this thing cranks. All right, so I've got the key right here. Let's go ahead and put it into the ignition and see if it cranks. Check that out, guys. Look at that. I am trying to crank this and nothing is happening. All right, so now that we've duplicated the problem, what I want to do next is I want to show you guys how we verify what circuit is giving us a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the starter relay out. We're going to put an adapter in there, and we're going to see what part of the starter relay is not working. All right, guys, so I've got my relay tester kit up here. I've already picked out the correct adapter. It's going to be this 4-pin for the 4-pin starter relay. I've already pulled the relay out of its hole right there, so we're going to plug this in place of the starter relay. And so now that we have that in place, before we stick this on there, let me take you guys over to the wiring diagram and show you how this relay is set up. All right, guys, so here we are taking a look at the wiring diagram for the starting system. Pretty simple setup, and really what we're going to be focusing on is going to be the starter relay, which is located right here. You can see this dotted line, this box, that's going to be our fuse box under the hood, and then this little rectangle box inside of that box is going to be our starter relay. Now this is just a basic 4-pin relay. We have our control side, and then we have our load side, or what I like to call the switching side. Now on the control side, we basically have an input on this pin 85 that comes from the engine computer. So if we follow this wire out, you can see that it comes from this dotted box right here. That's labeled the engine control module. And so the way this works is whenever you put the key into the crank position, this engine control module is going to send out a power on this wire here. And then that power is going to reach the control side of the relay. It's going to go through the coil winding of the relay. It's going to come out of the other side. And you're going to see that this goes straight to a ground, this G109 ground. Now, if you look here, this ground is a ground at all times. So what that means is that as soon as this ECM sends out this power, that immediately is going to energize the coil winding inside of this relay, which is going to create a magnetic field, and that's going to pull this switch closed. So when this switch gets closed, you're going to see that power is going to travel through this 30 amp fuse here. And if you follow it up, you can see that this fuse gets its power directly from the battery. So that means here on pin 30 of our relay is always going to be hot. It doesn't matter if the key is in the ignition or out of the ignition. We're always going to have a power here at pin 30 waiting for something to happen. Like I said, the ECM is going to send a power on this purple and white wire. It's going to energize this coil winding inside the relay. That's going to close the switch. Power is going to travel through this 30 amp fuse, and it's going to make its way down to the starter motor solenoid. Once the power reaches the starter motor solenoid, you're going to see that there is an internal ground to the starter here, and that's going to immediately activate the starter motor, which gets its power from this big battery cable here. And so on the starter motor, we basically have two terminals, our low current solenoid terminal, and then we have our high current battery terminal. And so in a nutshell, that's basically how the starter system works. It's very simple, very straightforward. Now let me tell you guys where things can go wrong here. Now, like I said, I have run into this problem before, and after posting a video about it, I realized that it's a pretty common problem. And so in my particular case, what I found was that when the fuse box heated up after a while of driving, we started to lose connection to the ground on this circuit here for the pin 86. And so the way I figured this out was, again, I drove the vehicle around until it got hot enough, and then it became a no crank, no start. And I went to the starter relay here, and I did my basic checks, and what I found was that I didn't have continuity to ground at this pin 86. And then what I found was that after pulling the fuse box out and disconnecting this X2 connector, finding this C10 pin, I checked it from here, and I did have continuity to ground. And so that proved that I didn't have any issue at the actual G109 ground. The problem was actually inside of the fuse box. The other interesting thing that I'd like to note here about this G109 ground is that this is actually a shared ground, and it shares it with several different components, one of them being the wiper motor. And so I didn't actually film this, but I did check to make sure whether or not the wiper motor was working, because if the wiper motor is working, then you can pretty much assume that this ground is still good. Anyway, like I said, in this case, the problem turned out to be inside of the fuse box. I did post a video about it a few years ago. Let me see if I can pull it up. All right, guys, so here we have the video. Like I said, this is one of my earliest videos. If you look down here at the date, you can see that I posted this back in January of 2018. In fact, I actually shot this video back in 2015 because I remember the house I was living in at the time, and that was the year that my son was born. And so I actually shot this video before I even had a YouTube channel. I shot it knowing that, eventually I wanted to share it online to help other people. And so it kind of sat in my hard drive until I eventually started the channel. And it was one of the earliest videos that I posted. Again, if you guys watch this video, it is an early video. I apologize ahead of time for the quality. At the time I didn't have the best camera and I was pretty nervous, so you might hear me stutter a lot. But like I said, I definitely recommend you guys to go back and watch this because I do explain how I figured out where the problem was. Anyways, if you guys look at the screen here, you can see that this is what the fuse box looks like when you take it apart. Now, taking apart the fuse box is not as easy as it seems on this vehicle. There are these bolts that go through the center of the box, and so I did have to drill out the little pieces that go in there, and I had to punch out the sleeves. And so, if you guys are going to do this, just remember that it does take a little bit of elbow grease to get this thing apart. But once you do take it apart, this is what it looks like. You can see that we have this kind of network of these copper wires that are embedded into the plastic. And now what I did when I took this apart is I located where the starter relay lived. And then because I knew I had a problem on the circuit for the ground, I basically followed that leg of the copper wiring to the other end of the fuse box. And so if you watch the video, you can see where I locate it. I'll show you right here. So this is our pin right here. Then I show you guys how I follow it up, and then show you guys where it comes out at the other end, where it's going to go out onto the wiring harness. And so what I did, because I knew I had a problem somewhere in this copper line here, is I actually set up sort of a little bit of a science experiment. If you look here, you can see where I clamped one of the terminals to my power supply on one end right here where the relay pin goes, and then I connected the other end to the outlet over here, the pin that goes out to the wiring harness, which eventually leads to our G109 ground. And so what I did using my power supply was I ran current through it, but at the same time, I actually wired in series this test light. So if you look over to the right of the screen, you'll see this test light is lit nice and brightly. And so what I found was that when I ran current through this board here on that particular copper wire, it was able to carry the current just fine, and it lit the test light nice and brightly. And so what I did was I took out a heat gun, which I'm going to play the video now. You can see me heating up the board with the heat gun. And if you guys pay attention to the test light over to the right, you're going to see that eventually it goes out like that. You guys see that? The test light went out. And so at the moment, you can see on the lab scope, we went down to 0 volts when earlier it had full 12 volt battery voltage from the power supply. And so heating up this board is what caused it to lose connection. And so what I started doing here was I took my little probe from my voltmeter, and I essentially kind of went down the line following this copper wire here. And I was looking for a point in which where I touch one side, I have voltage, and where I touch the other side, I don't have voltage, because that's where I'm going to find where our problem is. And so I kind of went down the line, and I was watching the multimeter here. If you guys look at the graphing meter, you can see I'm just kind of touching it along the copper wiring, and I'm looking for a dead spot. And so eventually I did find the dead spot, and it was right here. So if you guys take a look at where this little bend is, you can see that there's a little hairline crack. And so you're going to see it a little bit better when I zoom in on it. Right there, you see that fracture right here? This is where our problem is. And so what's happening is that as this fuse box is heating up, the plastic, I believe, is what's expanding. And so when the plastic housing expands, it's actually pulling this copper tubing or this copper wiring apart, and that's when it loses connection. And so when you let it sit for about 20 minutes or so, the plastic cools down, it contracts, and it allows this copper line here to reconnect. This little hairline fracture is what was causing our no crank, no start. Now, the way I actually fixed this was just by putting a dab of solder on here and rejoining the connection. And then I put it back together. And honestly, after I soldered this back together, it lasted for as long as the lady had the car, which was about 5 years before she eventually sold the car. Now, since posting the video, it's gathered about 66,000 views, which isn't terrible. But when you look down at the comment section and you read a few of these comments, you realize that I've actually been able to help a lot of people that have had the same problem. And so reading some of these comments just really fills my heart, because it really solidifies why I do this in trying to help people That's really what drives me to do what it is that I do on YouTube. And so just looking at some of these comments, it really makes me feel blessed that I'm able to do this. I mean, check out this comment here. This guy says, "Hey man, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the video. This was our issue, and after 3 months with the new fuse box, not a single issue. You don't understand how much you've helped my family. Seriously, we don't have the money to buy a new car. God bless you." I mean, there's tons of comments like this. I mean, check out this comment. You know, this person was saying that they had this problem for over 2 years now, and they couldn't figure out what the issue was. And so they, went through my video and they did the exact same thing that I did. And what's funny enough is that they're telling me that it was actually cracked in the exact same place on the exact same bend on their circuit board, which they're not the only people to tell me that. If you look through here, you're going to find that there's several people that mention that when they open up this fuse box, the crack is in the exact same spot. For example, here's another guy down here, Jesse Cortez, and you can see that he says, did this exact same test, except without a test light, and he found the same spot. It was split in the same spot as the spot in my video. So again, it really seems like this is some type of reoccurring problem that I think GM should be owning up to. They should have probably done a recall or at least some type of technical service bulletin, because when I looked into this recently, there still hasn't been a technical service bulletin letting technicians know that, hey, this problem could be inside of the fuse box. And so that's causing a lot of misdiagnosis. I mean, look at this guy right here. This Bill Wilson guy saying a lot of mechanics misdiagnosed the fuse block as a faulty ECU. I bought a Cobalt from a guy who spent $1,400 at the dealership who was unable to repair it, replaced the fuse box, and it was good to go. I mean, think about that, guys. Imagine you take your car to the dealership with this problem. These guys work on Chevys for a living, and if there's not a technical service bulletin telling them that this is a common problem, they may or may not know about it. They might end up replacing a lot of other parts, not being able to fix the problem, all because GM didn't even get around to making a technical service bulletin to help out the technicians. Now, before we move on, I do want to explain to you guys why sometimes we get that P0615 code for the starter relay circuit, because in my case, the first time I ran into this, I didn't have any trouble codes. Now, some of the people in the comment section mentioned that they had the code P0615, and so I did eventually tag that code in the video that I posted. That way people that had the code could find the video, and hopefully the video might be able to help them with their problem. But I do want to explain to you guys why sometimes we get the P0615, which in this case, the car that we're looking at the shop does have the P0615. And so the way the computer detects the P0615 is using a bias voltage. And so essentially, even when this circuit is open and the key is not in the crank position, the ECM is going to be sending out a bias voltage on this line here. And so this bias voltage, when it goes through the relay coil winding, it's going to come out on the other end and it's going to go directly to a ground. Now, because it's a bias voltage, it's a very low current voltage. And what that means is that as long as this relay is plugged in and as long as we have good continuity to ground, that bias voltage is going to be pulled down to ground. And so if we were to take a voltmeter and check pin 85 here with the relay plugged in, we should see 0 volts. Now, if we took the relay out of its socket and checked pin 85, we would see a bias voltage. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the bias voltage is 2.4 volts. So that's how the engine computer detects whether or not there's a problem with the starter relay. It basically is sending out that bias voltage and it's expecting the bias voltage to get brought down to ground. Now, when we have the problem inside of the fuse box where the copper wiring internal to the fuse box has fractured, it heats up, it separates, and we lose continuity to ground, what happens is that we see that bias voltage on pin 85, because at this point it no longer has a path to ground. And so that's why the computer sets the P0615, because all of a sudden it sees 2.4 volts here when it's expecting to see 0. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys, but essentially that's how the system works in a nutshell. Now let me take you back over to the vehicle and let's do our checks. All right guys, so now that we went over the wiring diagram, hopefully you understand what it is I'm trying to check here. So moving over to the starter relay, you can see that I did attach the relay to our adapter here. And so I do have the power probe connected to the battery terminals. And so what I want to show you guys is that when I take the power probe and I touch the pin right here, so this pin right here is going to be our battery power So it's got a battery power at all times. I'm going to touch it. You can see that we do have full battery voltage there. Now I'm going to touch the pin next to it. This pin is the pin that goes down to the starter motor. So when we touch this, we should see continuity to ground. So I'm going to touch it. You guys can see the power probe lights up green, and it does show that we do have continuity to ground. And so if we move to the other side of the adapter, let me turn my light on here. All right, so hopefully you guys can see that a little bit better. We're looking at the 2 pins on this side of the relay adapter. Now the pin to the left, closer to us, is going to be our ground for the control side of the relay, and the pin to the right is going to be the pin for the computer control. And so again, the way this works is that the computer is going to send a voltage out when you have the key in the cranking position, and that voltage is going to get grounded on this pin over here. And so what I remember from the last time I ran into this problem is that the problem was on the ground side. So when I touch this pin right here, let's see if we have a ground. All right, you guys can see that we do have a full good ground on this pin right here. Now, at this point, this circuit should be working. We've given it enough time to cool down, and so at this point, we should be able to actually start up the vehicle. Let me move inside real quick and see if we can start this thing up. All right, so I've got the key right here, and let's see if it starts up. All right, you guys hear that? It cranks up and starts. I'm gonna shut it off. We're gonna move back under the hood. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the heat gun and heat up the fuse box once again and see if we can lose connection on that ground. All right, guys, so for a visual aid, I went ahead and I took one of these terminals and attached it to our ground pin on that relay adapter. And if you guys can see, I have this blue wire connected to our power probe. Now, I know that beeping sound might be a little bit annoying, but we are going to use this as an audio and visual aid. And so right now we are showing that we do have continuity to ground. You can see that the green light lights up, showing us that we do have continuity to ground. Now we're gonna take our heat gun, turn this thing on. We're going to heat up the fuse box. We are going to watch and listen for the power probe to see if we lose continuity to ground. So I'm going to sit here and kind of heat this thing up. We're just going to watch the power probe and see if we lose continuity to ground. You guys see that? It's flickering. Watch it. All right, guys, so I was hoping to show you on the camera, but as you guys can see, for a moment, the ground did flicker, but I've been heating this thing up for a little while now, and it has not completely gone away, though that doesn't mean that we couldn't still have bad continuity to ground, because the power probe is actually very sensitive when it comes to finding a ground. Oh, you guys see that? You see how it's flickering? So we may show a ground, but maybe that ground just can't handle the current of the starter relay. So let me go ahead and try to crank the engine over and see if this thing starts or not. Got the key right here. Let's see if it'll start up. You guys can see we have a no crank. I'm gonna try it again. No crank. I am turning the key. See, no crank. Let's move back under the hood. All right, guys, so there you have it. Proof that our problem is inside of the fuse box. We have an issue with continuity to ground on the starter relay circuit, just like I saw in the last one. Again, once the engine temperature gets hot enough and the engine bay gets hot enough, the fuse box gets hot enough, then we have a connection problem internal to the fuse box. And again, as you guys can see, we're looking at our bias voltage here, 2.4 volts, where we should be seeing a ground. Again, I am connected to the ground pin here. And again, you can see that we're showing our bias voltage, which is coming from the ECM. Now, if you take a look, I'm gonna go ahead and pull the relay out, pull the starter relay out, and just watch the bias voltage disappear. Oh, accidentally pulled the whole thing out. Let me stick it back in. Okay, again, you can see our bias voltage. We should not have a bias voltage here. We should be seeing a ground. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull the relay out. I might need 2 hands for this. There's our relay. As you guys can see, our bias voltage is gone. Now, just to prove what it is I'm saying here, I'm gonna switch this terminal over to our computer control side and take a look. There's our bias voltage. Again, I'm gonna switch it back to where our ground should be. And you can see we have nothing. So again, proof that our problem is internal to the fuse box. All right, guys, so in conclusion, the car needs a new fuse box. Now, the shop owner did call the dealership to try to order one. Unfortunately, the part is on national back order, and they're saying that they're not even sure when they're gonna have availability. Now, this is something that I have heard from several people over the past few years. This thing has been on back order for a long time, so at this point, I'm not even sure if it's possible to get a new fuse box. The shop really wants to replace the fuse box. They don't want to try to go in there and fix it for a couple of different reasons. Number one is that the P0615 and the no crank, no start is not the only problem that this fuse box can have. I've actually seen several instances where people have issues with the vehicle going into reduced engine power mode because there's a fracture in the copper wiring, not in the same spot for the starter relay, but actually for the electronic throttle body. And so there's several different places inside of that fuse box that could be a potential failure spot. And so for that reason, they don't want to pay me to go in there to tear the box open to try to solder one little spot, you know, if there's a possibility that the fuse box is still going to have problems in the future. And so really, they're trying to get a new one. And so that's where they're at right now. I mean, it may come down to us having to do a temporary repair, you know, just to buy us time until we can get a new fuse box. And so they might end up asking me to do the repair on the fuse box, though right now, like I said, they're really more interested in finding a new one and just replacing it and being done with it. If they do decide to have me do the repair on the fuse box, then I will definitely make a video about it and I will post it on this channel. So do keep an eye out for that. Anyway, at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and end off the video. Like I always say, thank you guys for watching. I hope you found the video useful, informational, educational, entertaining. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.